recording this meeting. All right, so we kind of started talking about Dothraki on Tuesday, and that's where I kind of stopped the class. So we were watching a video of Dothraki and what were some of the decisions that David Peterson was making, for Dothraki. And what I'm going to be doing is kind of showing you what the thought process of David Peterson was with, creating the language. Like you heard in the video, there were a list of words that he received from the author of the books, the Song of Ice and Fire, that Game of Thrones is actually based on. The author's name is George R.R. Martin. And that was really his first step, right? So the way David Peterson created Dothraki is a little bit different from what you guys are doing for your constructed language, because you're really starting from scratch. But for David Peterson with Dothraki, he had a small list of words, right? About 56 words or so that he kind of started with, that existed in the books. And he took that and he built on that to, create other words in the language and other kind of bigger structures. So out of the 56 words that existed in the language, 24 of them were proper names. So they were names of people, names of cities, and those kind of stuff. So here are some of the proper names from Dothraki that he started to work with. Khal, Khalisi, Khalasar, Khalin. So you can already see that, all these words actually start with that ka, right? It is different from a regular k, like the regular velar plosive, but this is more of an aspirated variety. So, how you have aspirated sounds at the beginning of English, like pataka, all these three sounds can be aspirated. When you say pat, you say it with that aspirated, sound. It's very similar to that. Khal, Khalisi, Khalasar, and Khalin. So this is really what he started with. The next step that he did was he looked at the data. He looked at all the 56 words that he had from the books, and he figured out some of the phonotactic, syllabic kind of constraints that the language imposes on its syllables. So he identified two constraints, and they both have exceptions, as does many of these kind of constraints across languages. The first constraint that he identified was that the vowel u, it never occurs as a single vowel. So you can never have a syllable where you just have the vowel without the k preceding it. So it always appears in a cluster formation, or it always appears with a particular consonant, and it never really occurs as a singleton vowel. So that's the first kind of constraint that he identified from the small database that he had. And the second constraint was regarding the consonants b and b. These are never used in Dothraki. These are never seen in that 56 words that he had in his database. But like he says, there are always exceptions. Language always has exceptions. So these two constraints also has exceptions. But to create the phonetic inventory of Dothraki, he actually made a consonant inventory as well as a vowel inventory. So this is how a consonant inventory looks like. This is what I expect you to make for your constructed language. So it's really important that you have a table like this in your final project. I will be actually asking you to make a table like this for your constructed language in your next assignment. So you should already be starting to think of that. So as you can see, you have the manner of articulation on the stop affricate, fricative, nasal, etc. as the manner of articulation, and labial, dental, alveolar, palatal, velar, and uvular is the place of articulation. And as you can see, there is no labial stop. So this is the labial stop right here. You would have had p, b if that existed in Dothraki, but it does not. So he took that off. But you do have all the other plosives that English has. So yes, the difference between the t, d, right here, In English, you would see this as an alveolar stop, right? It would be right here to d. But in Dothraki, this is actually a dental stop. So it's pronounced as a th and a d, right? With your dental, with your teeth touching your lips, and not an alveolar. So you will never have a word, if you see a word like TAD in Dothraki, that would be pronounced as tad and not as tad, right? So that's the difference in the pronunciation. Again, in the affricate, Dothraki only has the voiced affricate j and not ch, right? So only one version, only the voiced version. And then in fricatives, you only have the th, not the z, right? And it also has a lot of velar sounds, as you can see, because in the video that we watched on Tuesday, we heard that Dothraki is a really guttural language because the people are, pretty rough and tough and, very macho. And so there's a lot of velar sounds that Dothraki actually has, and David Peterson actually added to the phonetic inventory. So you have the right? So that's the fricative, velar fricative. And then there's a lot of nasal sounds, right? A lot more nasal sounds than English. English only has 3 nasal sounds, but in Dothraki, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nasal sounds. So there's m, there's the dental n, the alveolar n, the palatal ny, the velar n, and the uvular ng, right? So there's all these different kinds of nasals, unlike English. There's a glides as very similar to English, the lateral, and then they have what Spanish has, the tap and the trill, so the r, right, and the ra, da. So as you can see, there are differences in the phonetic inventory, but this is completely based on what David Peterson actually had in the database. And he also made a vowel inventory. So the vowel inventory looks like this. I have simplified this vowel inventory for you. So if you remember seeing your IPA chart, you can draw the vowel inventory in a 3D space, but you can also just have a chart like this, right? And it's completely fine if you just want to do this kind of a chart for your constructed language rather than just, draw the 3D space, whatever is easiest for you. So here there are 2 different, there are 3 different heights and 2 different tongue positions. There's front and back and high, mid, and low. And there are 4 vowels in Dothraki. So there's E, O, A, and no U, because U always comes in a consonant cluster with the K. Right? So you never get it as a singleton vowel. So a very simple inventory, if you ask me, for the vowels, nothing too complicated, right? Please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, and feel free to unmute yourself because I cannot see everybody at one go. So after he figured out the kind of phonotactic constraints and the phonetic inventory, which is really where you should be starting as well for your constructed language, he moved on to syllable structures. He decided that now we can create more complicated words and decide on what the syllable structure should be for creating more words in Dothraki. So the intuition that he had, and that should be the same intuition that you should be working with for your constructed language, is basically if there's a particular syllable structure with X amount of words, there is likely to be more words in that syllable structure, right? So if you have a syllable structure where you have an onset, a nucleus, and a coda, you're more likely to have words which have onset, nucleus, and coda. So it's easier for him to kind of, create those words with that particular syllable structure. So I have this chart on the different syllable structures that Dothraki has. This is a really nice way, neat way to present your language to me as well. I highly recommend using tables as much as you can. Linguistics, we love tables. It's just a very neat way of organizing data, if you ask me. So Please feel free to use data in your assignments, in your final projects. I love data. I don't really care for text as much as I care for organization and getting all this neatly organized. So here are some examples of words that he created in Dothraki. These are new words that David Peterson created. So let me walk you through it. The first pattern that you observed was a C, we, C. C stands for consonant, we stands for vowel, and C again stands for consonant. So in the syllable structure, you have a consonant in the onset position, a vowel in the nucleus position, and a coda, a consonant coda. So it's a C, we, C syllable, right? Onset, a nucleus, and a coda. If you remember your syllabification algorithm and your syllable structure from a couple of weeks ago. And so the book words that he took inspiration from are words like kal and hajj and dosh. Kal, remember, the k, like I said, is an aspirated form. So the K and the H are not two consonants. So keep that in mind, right? So that's why it's a CVC pattern. So some of the words that he created are words like rek, kov, nit, maj, jin, has, fir, dim, chat. And then you can see he has complicated syllable structures, right? So you have a consonant with an optional consonant. So this is basically a consonant cluster in the onset position. And then you have the vowel in the nucleus. And then you have a consonant cluster again, an optional consonant cluster, and again a vowel. So these are words like hranna, shilla, motta, quisha, ricco, rossa, krista, chlelki, right? So more complicated kind of consonant structures. This is a consonant structure, again, an optional consonant cluster in the onset position, and then a vowel cluster, actually, right? A double vowel in the nucleus. So very similar to the diphthong in English, but there are no diphthongs in Dothraki. So it's just, we will just call this as a vowel cluster, and then an optional coda. So an example of this would be Raish, Roa, Noah, Lake, Kaor, Dain, Fies, Koel, Mai, and Yek, right? And then you again have, more complicated structures like Toloro and Kohoho and all that. So as you can see, definitely more complicated than English, some of these patterns especially. So once he created he figured out the syllable structure of Dothraki, the next step was to figure out the stress system. Why was the stress system important for David to figure out? Because stress plays a huge role in the intonation patterns of the language and in making sure that the language is very different from, especially if you have another language that is spoken in the same series. So what he did was he decided to create a different stress pattern from English. So what the rule that he created, or what he figured out, was that in Dothraki, all words that end in a consonant are stressed on the last syllable. So if you have a consonant in your final syllable position, right? So in the coda of the final syllable, especially if you have multiple syllables in the word, then you put the stress on that last syllable. Very different from English in the way that English actually does stress. So in English, you actually, there are different rules for stress. So depending on whether you're a noun or a verb, you actually get stress in either the ultimate syllable or the penultimate syllable, which is the syllable before the last syllable, etc. So stress in English it's a completely different kind of pattern as opposed to Dothraki. Then he also decided that, like I said, he wanted to make the language very guttural to kind of keep in line with the characters and the actors. So he used harsh and foreign sounds. So they were used in high frequency terms. So terms that you would hear on and again in different episodes of Game of Thrones. He doubled the vowels, so that's where you see the BB kind of pattern. And he also had all these kind of guttural sounds like k and h. So the advice that David has, and David, like I said, Dothraki was really just the beginning point. He has created a lot of different languages for movies and TV series. His advice to people who are creating constructed languages is always that the phonetic inventory is always just the starting point. You want to start with the phonetic inventory, but always think of the phonetic inventory as something that will be updated as the language changes and as the language grows, right? So you want to start with your phonetic inventory, but feel free to keep adding to it and keep taking off as you progress in your final project, and as you create more words in your language. You also need to figure out the phonotactics, because things like syllable structure and how many what kind of syllable structures can you have in your language? How many syllables can your words have? These are all important decisions that you would need to make for your language. Stress, again, one way of distinguishing your language from other language systems, as well as prefixes and suffixes and all these kind of declensions and endings and all that. So all those are also really, really important. All right, any questions on this? I actually thought that, because it's a nice snowy day, why don't we actually create the word for snow in your language? Okay, let's actually get some live practice on how we can create a word, right? Create a new word. So if, depending on whether you have a pen and paper or, however you want to do it, I will give you a couple of minutes to write the word snow in your language, and then we can discuss. So I'll share what I have. So that's what I did. Okay, so I started with a M. Well, my name starts with a M and my daughter's name starts with a M. So M is really close to my heart. So I wanted M in there, but it's also a nasal, it's a soft sound. So, it kind of goes with the idea of what snow is in my head, at least. And then I have a vowel that English does not have. This is a vowel that you would see a lot in Germanic and Scandinavian languages. It's a oo, like an umlaut. And then the L, which again is to me a very flowy kind of, it imitates the snow falling from the sky. And then E again is a vowel, so it's very flowy. So mooli, Muli, the word for snow, in a language that I don't have a constructed language, but if I had a constructed language, muli would be my first word. Okay, anybody else? Yeah, Kelly?
I just put
Okay.
Trashala.
Okay, that's is there like different suffixes and prefixes, or is it one word?
Well, I was trying to remember what my word that I had written down for water was.
Okay.
I don't have my stuff with me, so I was going to base it off of the word water, but I don't have that with me. So, but I do know that it's open syllabical, so it's
It always ends in a vowel, right?
yeah. So the end of every syllable is a vowel.
Perfect.
So
is that a compound word then for snow in your language? Would you think?
I would, yeah, if I had the word for water, it would be a compound, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. See, you already saw, right? So this is a very simple representation of snow, but what Kelly just did was she wants to take water, the word for water in her language, and add ice or something, or solid or something like that, and then create the word for snow, which is solidified water or something like that.
Right.
You would have to distinguish that from ice, obviously, but or maybe there's just one word for ice and snow in your language. So, that's also another possibility, but that's great. So you use compounding, you used open syllabification. That's great. I love that. Thank you. Anybody else? Erin, since I can see your face, do you have a word for snow, or did you create a word for snow? No? No, okay. I wasn't sure if you can hear me, but you can. Okay. Anybody else? Who wants to Nayel?
Mine is a compound word too, but it is Eshiden.
Eshigin?
Eshiden.
Okay, can you put that in the chat, please?
Like with IPA, because it's not spelled the way, it doesn't sound the way it's spelled in English.
Uh-huh. Okay, Eshiden. Oh, that's nice. Is that something that you created just now, or again going back?
Yes, I made that just now. I was trying to figure out, okay, snow. Well, how would my character, describe snow? And then I try to figure out what sounds sounded nicer with it, and like white, like is I don't know. I feel like I could probably refine that later, but more like a light sound too, I think. So yeah, I just came up with that right now.
Perfect. Yeah. And does it have any prefixes, suffixes, any, declensions, anything at all? Or is it just one word?
At the moment, it's one word because I haven't, worked that out yet. I'm going to set up my sentences and stuff.
Okay.
I started my character building, but those words I do have, it's a compound word right now. So each word I do have a sound for.
Perfect. I love that. Thank you. Anybody else? Trinity, Olivia, Megan?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So when we're creating our words in our language, I'm guessing there's going to be some overlap with other languages that exist just because there's so many. Is that just something that's kind of unavoidable, or should we be trying to create words that, okay, we look it up and it doesn't exist anywhere, or kind of what are your expectations?
Let me tell you, it's impossible to look through 7,000 languages in the world. It's not going to happen, even though we have state-of-the-art artificial intelligence and machine learning tools right now, right? It's impossible. That's I wouldn't know. I mean, you can tell me that this word exists in X language. How am I ever going to find that, right? I don't really think that's sustainable, right? And there is obviously going to be overlap with languages that either you take inspiration from, and I highly recommend that you take inspiration from languages, right? Don't get me wrong, like you cannot build a new language without taking inspiration from existing languages. Like that's completely not possible. Okay, so I highly recommend that you already have a couple of languages from your assignment 1, and you probably have identified a language for your assignment 2. These are meant to serve as your inspiration languages in some sense, right? So that's why, I gave you those assignments to kind of get you started. But obviously you can add to that, like if some of you may speak German or Italian or Spanish or sign language, and obviously you want to take inspiration from these languages that you speak as well. But definitely take inspiration. That's completely a-okay. Anybody else? Word for snow?
So I kind of took inspiration from more Slavic languages, at least for the way the words sound.
Okay.
And mine's Szepolke.
Oh, that sounds, yeah, definitely Eastern European, yeah, Slavic. And again, is that a word that's
it has a prefix. She means frozen and cold, and polka just means water.
Yay, I love that. Now that's different from what Kelly does, but very similar in the the logic and the intuition behind it. So Trinity has a prefix and a root word, and the prefix is the word for frozen, or it means frozen. So it's easy for you to create you can create popsicle, right? Which is like frozen plus sugar plus water, popsicle, right? Ice cream, obviously, again, very similar with the prefix che, and then the word for cream or milk or something like that. I love that strategy. That's a very cool strategy. Good job, Trinity.
Thanks.
Olivia, I saw that you unmuted yourself at the same time that Trinity did. So
yeah, so I was just thinking, and the reason I asked my question before was the first word that I kind of thought of was actually Finnish for something medical. So I kind of changed a little bit, and I'll put it in the chat since I don't have my camera today. But I kind of took it from the inspiration of like Spanish, the word for cloud, and then like Latin for snow, because I think I talked to you yesterday about kind of basing my language off of Latin. Yeah. So I did nievus or nievus. I haven't decided if I want to follow like the Latin V's pronounced as W's or more in a traditional sense. So let me put it in the chat, but that is what I came up with.
Cool.
No.
Do you already see how different each of us came up with a different word? None of our sounds are similar. None of our vowels are similar. None of our strategies are similar either, right? I went with a very traditional, simple strategy because, obviously I'm not thinking of creating a constructed language. That's your job, not my job, right? So in my head, I wanted to keep it simple and flowing and, so I went with a very simple strategy. Kelly went with a compounding strategy. Nayel, very similar again to a compounding strategy, but also taking inspiration from words that exist in a language already. Trinity went with a prefixation strategy, and Olivia went with that, that Latin combination with modifying a word that already exists in Spanish. So, this is it shows you the diversity of constructed languages and creating languages. Just all of us, nobody had the same word, right? Isn't that cool? I always find it so incredible. 20 years after teaching linguistics, I still find this pretty amazing. And the reason why I teach linguistics. All right, so now that we got our hands dirty in creating a word in a constructed language, let's look at another language, again created by David Peterson, but for a completely different enterprise. This is a game actually called Defiance, and I believe that maybe it was also a TV series. There are many TV series called Defiance, so I'm not entirely sure if it's the same one or not, but this was actually a video game. He was commissioned to make this language for the video game Defiance. And in the video game, there is an alien race there are actually 2 alien races. And this alien race is called I think you pronounce it Irathian. I'm not always sure whether it's Irathian or Irathian, but something along those lines, but that's a spelling of that alien race. And the other alien race is the Castethans, and we will talk about the Casthethan language as well, so that I can show you how he distinguished between the 2 different alien races within the same game. So because there were 2 different alien races, and he was commissioned to make the language for both these different races, he was in a spot where he had to make these languages very different from each other, right? So this was a very different kind of assignment from his Dothraki assignment. So what he actually did was, one was a head final language and one was a head initial language. What do I mean by head final and head initial language? Head final language is when you have the verb appear at the end of the sentence, right? So you have subject, object, verb, like in Japanese, right? That's a head final language. And a head initial language is like English and Spanish, where you have the verb immediately following the subject. So you have subject, verb, and object in a head initial language, and in the head final language, you have subject, object, verb, right? So this is how he kind of made the languages sound very different. And he also took inspiration. So Olivia, a lot of your questions are being answered in today's lecture, as you can see. David Peterson actually took inspiration from the language Inuktitut. So Inuktitut is actually an Eskimo language. So you might have heard of the Eskimo language. That's exactly what Inuktitut is. There are different kinds of Eskimo languages. So Inuktitut is one of the Eskimo languages. It belongs to the Eskimo Aleut family of languages. English belongs to the Indo-European family of languages, the same family of languages that has Spanish and Italian and German and Romanian and all that. And Inuktitut is a different language family, so the Eskimo Aleut family. And he actually drew on his own experience with creating a language for the movie called Atanarhuat, the Fast Runner, which is basically a movie based in Alaska, and it draws inspiration from the Inuktitut language of families. So here is the area where Inuktitut languages are spoken. So as you can see, North America, but past Canada, right, and parts of Canada, parts of Greenland, and parts of like Antarctica. And as you can see, there are many different kinds of Inuktitut languages, right? Each of these color codings is a different language, basically. So there's a lot of variety. It's not different dialects. These are different individual languages of the Inuit people. So there's no way that we can kind of club them together and say that there's one language with different dialects, but these are all individual, non-mutually intelligible languages of the Inuit family. So I thought we can get our, oh my goodness. I'm hoping that PowerPoint did not crash. It just disappeared. Let's listen to how Inuktitut actually sounds like. Okay.
Check out this verbo. Oh man. They're your cousins. Look at me. Here I am. Right where I belong.
How do I say in Inuktitut? Kano Inuktitut uhagalakaga. How do I say in Inuktitut? Kano Inuktitut uhagalakaga. Kano Inuktitut uhagalakaga. Could you speak more slowly? Sukayaklutit uhagonakit Could you speak more slowly? Sukaigarlutit uharunakit. Sukaigarlutit uharunakit. Do you speak English? Halunatitu sunguvit. Do you speak English? Halunatitu sunguvit. Halunatitu sunguvit. Do you understand me? Tukisivinga. Do you understand me? Tukisivinga. Tukisivinga.
What did you think of Enoctate? Similar to English, different?
I thought it was interesting that instead of using like a word, an Enoctate word for each English word, like replacing it, it's like just one big word or two long words. So would that be like prefixation and that kind of thing? Or, okay.
That's actually, I will tell you the word in a minute. I know Kelly wants to say something. So, you know, let's hear what Kelly wants to say, and then I will tell you what that strategy is.
I was just gonna say it's very different than English. I think it almost had some similar sounds to like the French language.
Okay.
But
That's
that's
what
all.
it sounded more French to you than English?
Yeah.
Okay. So the word that the process that Olivia was talking about is called as noun incorporation. So it was an example that we saw when I talked to you about the typology of languages, synthetic languages and fusional languages. Noun incorporation is when you have an object that is inserted into the verb to create one word, right? It's called noun incorporation. It's a very rampant aerial phenomenon in Enoctate languages. It's very, very common. So what you see as that one big word is actually multiple words combined into one big word because of noun incorporation, right? So again, a strategy that's very different from English, I want to say, and definitely something that, you know, if you're interested in using, you can read up more about. I think a couple of, you know, readings that David Peterson I put up on Blackboard actually talks about noun incorporation. So that's something that you could, you know, kind of look at if you're interested in using for your own language. All right, let's go back to Enoctate. So what David Peterson did was to draw, you know, inspiration from Enoctate nouns and create Erathian nouns based on that. So what he did was the root of the word, right, itself is short. So it's monosyllabic. The root of the word is always monosyllabic. It's just one syllable, short. But each noun would mark its number with a final vowel. Do you know the meaning of number? Like in languages, what is number? No? So let's start with gender. Gender is easy, right? Gender in languages, Spanish is a classic example of a language that marks gender on its noun. So you have O and A ending marked by a vowel, that's gender, right? So Pedro is a Pedro is probably not a good example, but like hablo versus habla, right? With the O and the A is probably a better example of gender. Now you also have person marking, right? So you can have first person, second person, third person markings on verbs and even nouns and adjectives and all that. And again, these are marked by different prefixes or suffixes and, you know, vowel marking, etc. And that's also something that, you know, you can again see across different languages. Number is singular versus plural. That's number. Okay, so person, number, and gender. Three things that are always marked on nouns, or mostly marked on nouns: person, number, gender. person, first person, second person, third person, number, singular, plural, gender, masculine, feminine, neutral, right? So singular and plural nouns were the same length. The length did not distinguish them, right? As opposed to English, where you have plural marking as a suffixation. And each noun would have a class prefix. So what are class prefixes? For class prefixes, he actually took inspiration from, he moved from Inuit and Antarctica languages, and he went all the way to Africa, right, where Bantu languages are spoken. A lot of Bantu languages have what is known as noun classes. Noun classes are actually prefixes, and depending on the prefix, you can actually identify the noun classes. So here is an example of Sesotho, which is a Bantu language spoken in Africa. And I've given you a table with different classes, noun classes, as well as a singular form and the plural form, because depending on whether it's singular and a plural noun, the class actually changes. They don't really belong to the same class anymore. So you have the word for person, first class, first noun class, in the singular form, motto, in the plural form, class 2, batto, right? So now you can see that the noun class mo is a first noun class, and the noun class ba is a second noun class, even though it's the plural version of the singular noun person, right? The word for and is rakadi, rakadi, 1A and 2A. Why is it called 1A and 2A? Because the singular form does not have the mo, right? You would expect mo rakadi, because the plural is still bo rakadi, but you don't get the mo, right? So it's a subset of the first noun class where these nouns actually do not take the mo prefixation, right? So, but it still takes the plural second class prefixation bo. It's slightly different from the form ba and bo, but you do not have a counterpart mo or ma for rakadi, for the first singular and. The word for dress, mose, mese, day and sun, la satsi, masatsi, tree, safate, difate, dog, ninja, dinja, hill, bofelo, no plural because, it doesn't have a plural counterpart. And to cook, which is again a verb, so it doesn't have a singular plural distinctions, just hopela, hopeha. Actually, so to cook is the verb, but they derive the noun from that. So the word cook, right? Like the cook is in the kitchen, kind of, yeah. So that's the word hopeha. So this is something that's very prevalent in Bantu languages. Swahili has the same thing. Zulu has the same thing. A lot of different languages from Bantu actually has noun classes. And what he did was, David Peterson did for Iratian, he actually borrowed and, he created these class prefixes, but they did not change the number. So there was no difference in singular and plural in Iratian. They just had one noun prefix. And he also created vowels inspired from an auxiliary language, which that's a constructed language, Afrihili. And these are how it looked like. So he had a script for Iratian, as well as different vowels that actually, some of the vowels look really different from each other, but they're basically just e, u, a. Right? But his inspiration was from Afrihili, which was an auxiliary language. So here are some examples of what he did for Iratian. So he actually, so one of the things that he actually did was he created a word, and then he added a dangerous being to it. So the distinction that he had was between non-dangerous and dangerous. So he had Iratian beings and dangerous Iratian beings. There's, things that are passive and things that are aggressive. So he had a distinction between that. Animals and dangerous animals, plants, dangerous plants, So basically, it's a distinction between like a poisonous and a non-poisonous plant or something like that, what he means by dangerous plants. And depending on whether the object was dangerous or non-dangerous, it had a different prefix. So that was how he distinguished the noun classes as opposed to the number distinction in Bantu languages. So if you had a plant, it belonged to noun class 5, and the prefix was the, and the singular suffix was a. So you had the word for plant, and a. That's how the word would be for just plants. If it's a poisonous plant or the dangerous plant version, then you would belong to noun class 6 with the prefix ge, the root of the word, and the singular suffix u. So there's a lot of information that he packed into these prefixes and suffixes. Very cool. I've had a couple of students actually take a lot of inspiration from this and use this for their own languages, especially if you want to create, a complex noun morphology. You can keep your verbs simple, you can keep your adjectives simple, and then you can just create a very complicated noun morphology just like this. That's actually pretty cool, if you ask me. So highly recommend, looking at this chart and seeing if something like this could be used for your language, or you can take inspiration from this and, create. You don't need to have 10 noun classes, you can just have like a couple of them, like 2 or 3. But highly recommend looking into this. Okay, so let's listen to a sample of Iratian with all these noun classes.
Peterson is right here. Created the language, and it's been I think it definitely gives the show a wonderful depth to the indigenes. The 7 Votan races here today. Me and my wife Jamie are playing Daytak and Stammer. They're Castatans. Stephanie's an Arathian. There's also indigenes, and David's created this language. So there's
where they talk about
there's things they say like Shafia Lemunda Jegora Bila Kamira Jidoa Zara Hallelujah Kazara Gona Banga Kura Shah Sulu. And that's with fries.
So you saw, right? Like, let me back it up a little bit.
Kura Shah Sulu. And there's things they say like Shafia Lemunda Jegora Bila Kamira Jidoa Zara Hallelujah Kazara Gona Banga Kura Shah Sulu. And
right? So again, really, it sounded like, to me, that sounds like Arabic or, some language from like the Middle East. But again, very different sounding from Enoctate, if you ask me, even though he took a lot of inspiration from Enoctate and Bantu languages. So that's Iratian. And that is the end of that lecture slide. I was supposed to finish that on Tuesday. I didn't. So let's actually move into looking at how the other alien race was different from Iratians. That's okay. Let's get into this lecture slide. Perfect. So before we get, maybe we can actually start with Iratian and then come back to Valyrian. Just because we are talking about Iratian right now. Okay, so let's actually look at the other alien race in the Defiance game series. So this is the alien race Castethan. Already you can see, right? So different just in the character building, right? How they look, They're just so different from the Irathian. So you can see that even though they're two different alien races, what do you, when you see this photograph, what's the first thing that comes to your head? Who do they look like?
They look kind of like a mix between the elves from Lord of the Ring and then the Twilight vampire family.
I was going to say vampires.
Yeah, that's, vampires for sure, but I can definitely see that elvish kind of resemblance that you're talking about, especially with the hair and, the silver colors and all that. But definitely, like, if you did not tell me that this was the Castithan alien race, I would have said vampire, right, from Twilight. So definitely very different looking from Irathian or Irathian alien race. So we just talked about Irathian, so I think it's good to kind of get the difference between Castithan and Irathian. One of the things that David Peterson did for Castithan is to create a writing system, right? So he had a writing system, but he had a writing system for Irathian too, but obviously the way that he did the writing system for Castithan and Irathian are quite different. So this is the writing system for Irathian, right? And again, you don't have to create a script for your language. I've had students do it in the past. If you want to do it, that's fine. Be my guest, but that's not a requirement for your grade. I just want to put that out there. But I think it's useful to look at different constructed language writing systems. So Irathian was actually a writing system that was easier for Peterson to make because of the kind of the alien race that Irathians were. They were peace-loving people, right? They did not want to go out there, colonize other planets and other races. They were actually peace-loving. So the kind of writing system that he created went with the kind of personality and the kind of people that particular race was. The Castithan alien race, on the other hand, was very different, right? So they were savvy, they were clever, they were powerful. They wanted to go out there and colonize all these different planets and other races on these planets. So I have this analogy that the Castithan language is actually like the English of the earth, because, English language was one of the earliest colonizing languages. And the fact that we are speaking English today is also because of colonization. So the Castithan and the Irathians are actually very, very different with respect to, their personality and their traits. So the writing system also kind of reflected that. So what David Peterson actually did was he had different versions of Castithan, but he created something called Proto-Castithan. So Proto-Castithan is always the first version of the script. So English, the way that we write it now, was not how it was written many, many years ago, right? If you look at Old English looked very different from, how you would write the English Roman script right now, right? So that's the same thing with Castithan. He actually used hieroglyphics from the Egyptian system to actually make Proto-Castithan. So this is kind of how it looked like. So there are different versions of it, as you can see. So he started with the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So that's in 1. And then that's Proto-Castithan. And then there's it evolved. The writing script evolved and it created the second version. And then the final version in 3, right? So you can see how different the first version and the third version looks like. The third version looks like something that you could, pull up a keyboard on the computer and type it out. But definitely the first one does not look like that. The first one looks like it was drawn with pen and on a paper. So here is, other examples of the writing script as well. And again, like I said, many of these kind of symbols are not simple. They're quite complicated, and which is kind of, it goes with the fact that the Castithans are very powerful and they wanted to go out there and colonize different races. So here is an example of different words in Castithan, and I've given you the transliteration in English so that you can read the script, because none of us know how to read Castithan. So this is how you would write the word in the Castithan script. Anybody who does this script remind you of anything? Any other script that you know of? Definitely not English, right, if you ask me. But any other script that you're familiar with? No? This actually reminds me of a couple of different Indian languages, because we have very similar looking scripts where, you draw these kind of round things to indicate a vowel, etc. So if you had told me that this was an Indian language, I would have been like, yeah, sure. So this is the protoform. This is the Proto-Castilian form, the first form of the language. And then you have the modern form of the language. So as you can see, there are some things that have changed, right? And some things that have stayed the same. But obviously, none of the modern forms are similar to the proto-forms. So this is very similar to what, if you do history of English with me, and I know a couple of you are in history of English this semester, this is what we do when we look at Old English versus Middle English and Modern English. We look at how a particular word has changed from its original form to, the newer kind of form. So this is something, again, that, you can do for your own languages, I think. You could create a form, and as the semester goes by, you can maybe, change the form and create new forms from it. So very similar to this process of creating the first form and then changing it and revising it, in different stages, if you will. So I think that's a strategy that I highly recommend as well. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of this lecture slide. All right. So we spoke about Dothraki today as well. I want to talk about another language in the same Game of Thrones series, because, again, I kind of want you to see these case studies as contrasting with each other so that you can see how one person can create so many different languages depending on, the prompts that he was given when he was creating all these different languages. So Valyrian is another language that you hear in Game of Thrones, and it was created specifically for the third season of Game of Thrones. And again, very similar to Dothraki, David started with a database or a small set of names. So he had some proper names and 6 words that he relied on from the book. So the words were Valonqar, Valar, Morghulis, Duheres, Drakari, and Nagi. These were the words that he started with. And one of the things that he had to do was that there were different forms of Valyrian depending on who spoke it. So there was a High Valyrian, very similar to the high form of Elvish, spoken by people who belonged to that particular tribe. So High Valyrian is the language of the Old Valyrian freehold. So it's High Valyrian spoken by people who only belong to the Old Valyrian freehold. This is how a map of the Valyrian place or map of that particular area look like. And so the Old Valyrian freehold spoke what is known as the High Valyrian. This is a photograph of the Valyrians. Oh, I often get this question. Students ask me whether they can take inspiration from, science fiction and fantasy characters that exist on the web, like, these kind of images. My answer is yes, you can definitely base your character off of, these characters that have somebody else has illustrated and put on the web. Always cite that information for me. Just tell me where you took that information from, especially if you have not drawn it. I also, in the past, I've had students who create their own, if you can draw and you're a good illustrator, you can also create your own character and, put that in your final project. But obviously not everybody can draw. I cannot draw for nuts. So I highly recommend you can take inspiration from existing images on the web. Just let me know where you take it from. Okay, because somebody else drew it. So I just want to know where you take that information from. But if you want to use this picture, for example, you don't need to say that these are the Valyrians. You can call them whatever you want to call them, right? You can give these characters names, you can give them, a different language, but just maybe use this image as an inspiration or something like that. So these are how the Valyrians look like. And they are conquerors. So they went around conquering a lot of lands, including in the book and the series, what is known as the Old Giscari Empire. And they also had a lot of influence across, the Isle of Dragonstone across the Narrow Sea. Let me try to find out here. This is Dragonstone and the Narrow Sea. So this is the area that they were at, the Valyrians. So they were quite prosperous. They conquered a lot of lands, but there was an event called the Doom of Valyria, and the Valyrians were completely wiped out during this Doom of Valyria. It was kind of like the event that wiped out dinosaurs from Earth. It was very similar to that. It was a cataclysmic event, a catastrophic event. Now, after the Doom, the languages of Valyrian that survived were not the High Valyrian anymore, because many of the people who spoke High Valyrian died. So the languages that survived after the Doom of Valyria is called as the Bastard Valyrian languages. So these were the lower class, low Valyrian, if you will, languages that survived. It was called Bastard Valyrian. The difference between the two, High Valyrian had the same status as Latin, very similar and modeled on what happened in the Roman Empire. And Bastard Valyrian was the same as the status of other Romance languages like Italian and French, as opposed to Latin at that age, So that was how High Valyrian and Bastard Valyrian were modeled. So here are two phrases in Valyrian, Valar Morgulis and Valar Doheres. Okay, Valar Morgulis and Valar Doheres. Now, you can obviously see that there are a lot of similarities between the two phrases, right? Valar is the same, and Morgul is at the end, the suffixation is the same. The only difference between the two is Morgul and Doher, right? And that, if you probably go with the common factor and the, what is remaining, you can probably guess that Morgul is die and Doher is serve, right? And is probably the word for must, and Valar is probably the word for all men. One of the things that Valyrian actually does, and again, keeping in line with our conversation on number, we talked about number marking in Bantu languages, we talked about number marking in Iratian, but in Valyrian, the way that number marking happens is slightly different. So in English, you actually have number marking marked twice. First on the numeral, like 3 or 2 or 5 or whatever the number is, and the plural marking suffixation. So you have 3 books, 3 encodes plurality, and so does the S. So in some sense, English plural marking is redundant, right? You don't need to mark plural twice, right? But you do anyway. So that's 3 books. But some other languages only do it with the numeral. There's no plural marking on the noun itself. So 3 book. My mother tongue, Malayalam, is an example of a language that actually does this. So in my language, I only have the word for 3, and the word for book, I don't have a plural marking. So it's Moona Pustagam. Pustagam is the word for book in Malayalam, and it means singular book. It could also mean plural book. It's ambiguous actually between singular and plural. And Moona is the word for 3. So Moona Pustagam means 3 books, right? Without the S kind of marking, similar to English. In Valyrian, so I want to go back to the phrase Valar, which we correctly identified as all men, right? How do we decide what is all and what is men? It's just one word, Valar, right? We don't have enough data to distinguish whether it's Val is men or Ar is all, we don't know. Now, the reason we cannot decide is because the way Valyrian does number is different from English. Valyrian does not have a distinction between singular and plural. What Valyrian has is called as a collective number. So Vala is singular, Valar is collective, all, right? All inclusive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a third kind or a fourth kind of category to number in Valyrian. So you have singular, plural, and collective. Vala, Valar, collective number. English does not have collective number. And David Peterson added a fourth kind of number called pokel. Pokel is basically, it introduces plurality with a relative small cardinality. So in English, an example of a pokel number is a few. When I say a few people came, how do you understand the meaning of that?
More than two.
Okay, but is there an upper limit? Is there, if 10 people came, would you say a few came?
Usually when I think of a few, I think of it being, I don't know, maybe between like 2 to 10.
Okay.
It's non-specific, but like if it were 10 or more, I might say several instead of few.
Okay, so now let me give you a context, Kelly. So for President Muma's inauguration, they were expecting 500 people to come to the inauguration, but only 100 came. Do you still say a few people came at that point, or do you say several people came at that point?
Yeah, I guess you could say a few people if you're
Right.
contrasting a larger number. Yeah.
Right. So that's that. So I think it is in that sense that we understand a few as having no specific upper bound. Although, I mean, completely, if you don't have that context, I agree that, you probably have an upper limit to it, like 2 to 10 or, something like that. But in that particular context, you can see that, even though 100 is definitely not a few, like if there's no context, but compared to 500 people, 100 is a few, right? So it's in that sense that I think I, have that parentheses there, that there is no specific upper bound for a few in English. So here is a number system of Valyrian. So there's singular, plural, collective, and pokel. And again, after I do this lecture, I always get a couple of students excited in doing something like this for their own language. So I highly recommend, reviewing this material and seeing if this will work for your language. It's pretty cool way of distinguishing your language from other Romance languages and English type of languages. So the number system of Valyrian is as follows. Singular is 1. The verb agreement is singular, right? So you have book, that's it. You don't have any other marking on the verb or, any other marking on the verb. And the logic is that there is one person doing this action, right? So there's one actor. Plural is many, and you have plural agreement on the verb. And there's multiple actors, but they are not treated as a cohesive unit. So there are, multiple people. So if you have multiple pens, I can't find any other pen other than this one. But if you have multiple pens at this point or multiple people at this point, they're all individual. They're not treated as one unit. That's plural. The opposite of that is collective, where you use the number all, right? So all men collectively. So you use a singular verb agreement. In English, if you ask me an analogy, committee, right? When you use the word committee, you often think about the committee as one cohesive unit, right? There are multiple people in the committee. You cannot have a committee of one, right? When you say committee, you have multiple people in the committee, and you say the committee made this decision, right, with the singular verbal agreement. right? You don't say the committee, with the plural verbal agreement, because you're kind of treating it all as one cohesive kind of unit. And the fourth number system of Valyrian, which is the rare number system, that you don't find across languages. You find this in very, very few languages, if you ask me, is called Pokel, and it means a few, but it has a verbal agreement of plural. It's a small number of actors, right? There's no upper bound, but there's a small number of actors, but they're not treated as a cohesive unit. I have an illustration. It's a little difficult to wrap your head around, I think, especially if this is the first time you're hearing it. So you have singular, right? One actor acting individually with the singular agreement, plural. So as you can see, there are many actors, but they are not treated together as one cohesive unit. So you get the plural agreement. Collective, right? They are all actors in Game of Thrones. So it's one cohesive unit. At that point, you get singular agreement again, not plural agreement on the verb. And then you have Pokel. So you have a couple of actors. You use a plural agreement, but it is not a cohesive unit. So you say a few, right? Does this visual image drive home the point a little better? Because I know that it's not an easy concept to get your head around, but once you have a visual image, I think, for me at least, I'm a visual person, so I like this idea of looking at the visual to understand what that means. So and this is the best example I could find. Again, Kelly, I know you watch Game of Thrones, so you probably relate to this a lot better. I don't watch Game of Thrones, but I think it's still understandable as an example. So, okay, we are 2 minutes away. So let me see if I can, I think this is a good place to stop, because, I'm going to get into tense and aspect, and that's a whole different concept. So since we have 2 minutes left, any questions on anything we covered today? Do you feel more confident in doing your own constructed language now that you kind of, you've got a little bit of couple of different strategies today in last class? Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked seeing the tables. The tables made everything make way more sense as you explained it.
Yeah. And I highly recommend using tables for your assignments as well. Like I said, I say 3 pages, 1.5 space times New Roman, but really what I mean is give me tables. I like I said, this is not an English class. You don't have to write an essay for me. Organize your data into tables, label them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and give them names, and so that's really what I'm looking for. And I think that's how I want your final project as well. So it kind of gives you an insight into what I'm looking for in your final project. So. Perfect. Keep warm and keep safe if you're driving. Stay safe on the roads, and I will see you next Tuesday. Bye. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.